The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I assume most of our audience has heard by now that there has been another shooting at Fort Hood. Of course, Fort Hood was the location of a 2009 shooting where 13 individuals were killed. This latest shooting at Fort Hood left 4 people dead, including the shooter, multiple injuries. We are producing today's program a little earlier than normal. So if some of the information that has now been confirmed is only speculation at this point, it may be missing from our report. Initially, Lieutenant General Mark Milley didn't say at the press conference that was held the day of the shooting who the shooter was, although he did say it was a soldier treated for depression, anxiety, and a variety of other psychological and psychiatric issues, who had served 4 months in Iraq in 2011. Since that initial press conference, we learned much more, including from Republican Congressman Michael McCall, who said that the suspected shooter is Ivan Lopez and that Lopez was wearing an Army uniform during the incident. We also learned that although on the one hand, there seems to have been treatment or at least an indication that Lopez should be treated for PTSD, it also was revealed, at least at this time, that he never actually saw combat in Iraq, which raised some questions in general about the alleged shooter. He was using a .45 caliber handgun, allegedly entered a building on the base and opened fire, according to Milley. Left, got into a vehicle, opened fire again, and then entered a second building where he unleashed another burst of gunfire. There was no indication that this was any kind of a terroristic type incident. And it's interesting when you hear that because, of course, this caused terror. So to say it wasn't an indication of terrorism, what it usually means is it wasn't some broader plot involving others. It was the, as we often hear, the lone gunman type of scenario, although nothing was initially ruled out by the military. Some say that we have a problem in this country of too many guns. And the gun advocates who say that we actually need more guns to be safer responded to this incident by saying, well, you actually need to have more people with guns. The reason this even got as far as it did is because in Fort Hood, unless you're under specific orders where you are armed, you are not carrying a weapon, and that if everybody had guns, it would have been way safer for everyone. What is true about that? We can't deny that if everybody had guns, initially, right when this guy starts firing, somebody nearby can fire right back. The problem is that these shootouts, these crossfires, I don't know how they are kind of idealized by the pro-gun crowd, but it's not that it's abundantly clear that everybody who has a gun, imagine everybody's armed, sees what's going on and say, oh, that's the guy. I take my gun out, I shoot him once, and that's it. Multiple people may start shooting. At that point, it's not clear who the shooter is. You might shoot someone who was just trying to take down the shooter. The idea that these things just go really well is silly. And I think one of the best examples is the Batman movie theater shooting, where some said, well, if everybody in the theater had been armed, or if at least a few people had, it would have been great. Well, I don't know about that. If all of a sudden people start firing in a dark theater towards who they believe to be the shooter, that's a recipe for a huge disaster. The media coverage surrounding the second Fort Hood shooting, I guess just to say the second since 2009, has been not that good. I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by that. Lots of speculation, lots of fear-mongering, all sorts of stuff. Megyn Kelly on Fox News, I'm not even going to bother to play the video from this, at the beginning of her show on the night of the shooting said that they're choosing not to identify the shooter, Ivan Lopez, the alleged shooter, Ivan Lopez. But then later in the show said, you can find out his name elsewhere, but it is a Hispanic, Latino-sounding name. So that's actually really interesting because when we look at the reasons not to provide the shooter's name, you would think that part of it is not to inflame people, not to get people, not to glorify the shooter is also a big thing. But if you start just talking about the shooter's race, where you find it okay and acceptable and important to state the shooter's race and ethnic background, but not their name, what are you really saying about race as a factor in this shooting? It was a very bizarre clip from Megyn Kelly. Also strange, on the Sean Hannity program that same night, Sean Hannity invites former Florida Tea Party Republican Congressman Allen West. Okay, Allen West is a guy that we covered extensively when he was a congressman. He has these just very strange stories in his background about how he treated his I don't know what's the opposite of superiors in the military, not his inferiors, but those ranked below him, and just a long history of really treating people poorly. And he went on Hannity to comment about the Fort Hood shooting, and he was able to do something amazing, which is Allen West, former Tea Party Republican congressman, was able to connect the Fort Hood shooting to President Obama's statements on Crimea. Watch this.
Let me go to the big picture about combating evil in our time. And this goes back to man-caused disasters, overseas contingency operations, that Major Hassan was workplace violence. Have we gotten too far away from 9/11 that we don't remember the impact of that day?
I believe that's a part of it, and I believe also we have a civilian leadership that does not want to recognize that an enemy exists. You know, you look at what is happening in the Crimea when the president says that Vladimir Putin is operating from a position of weakness.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to admit that there's evil, if you don't want to admit that there's an enemy, then you don't have the right type of security protocols in place.
And all right, it's good to see you. Colonel, I'll have you back.
Allen West is proof positive, ladies and gentlemen, that the military is way, way too lax in enlisting totally fringe, lunatic people and promoting them to ranks way beyond what would be considered reasonable given the statements that they make. It's sort of like when he talks about President Obama and how what he said is the same type of thing that is connected to the Fort Hood shooting. I'm thinking to myself, if a comet that was set into motion billions of years ago was on a trajectory to hit Earth and we found out about that tomorrow, someone on the right would figure out a way to tie it to President Obama. Very bizarre from Allen West. And for those who are saying, well, he's not saying that what President Obama said about Crimea caused the Fort Hood shooting, I agree with you. He's not saying that, but you're asked a question about Fort Hood, you're speaking about Fort Hood, and to even create this very roundabout logic trail that gets us back to what President Obama, the types of statements that people like President Obama make on Crimea, if not deliberately misleading, are completely irrelevant. I mean, just answer the question without criticizing President Obama. Is it even possible? How far does this go where no matter what question you're asked, you figure out a way to criticize President Obama? In Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah is cracking down on people who disagree with the country's established religion, which is Islam, if you didn't know. And according to some new laws there, people who don't believe in God can be considered terrorists, and they can actually face jail time in certain circumstances. Not believing in God is, in short, not really an option in Saudi Arabia. The Middle Eastern country has issued new legislation that labels all atheists as potential terrorists who are a threat to public order. Article 1 of the new provisions define terrorism as, quote, calling for atheist thought in any form or calling into question the fundamentals of the Islamic religion on which this country is based. The kingdom has never been particularly friendly towards atheism. Islam is written directly into the Constitution. It's the established state religion. It is a theocracy. But the new laws are more a reflection of King Abdullah's desire to clamp down on political dissent. Remember, when the government is the religion, religious dissent is essentially political dissent because they are one in the same. The question I have when I see these things is, how fragile does your government have to be? Or how fragile does your worldview have to be that the mere mention of not believing in the religion, the mere mention of atheism, is a problem that has to be criminalized or demonized? That is truly a red flag. The question to American right-wingers is, this, given that what is going on in Saudi Arabia is a few steps ahead of what so many in the American religious right want. Law based on what the Bible says. On our last program, talking about Louis Gohmert saying that actually the way that our country was designed is that church does influence the state. Two men who love each other can't get married because that's what the Bible says. Really pushing these theocratic type beliefs. Why don't some of the American right-wingers who want that type of Christian Sharia law in the United States, why don't they look at places like Saudi Arabia, which they don't like? You would think they'd make the connection. They'd say so much of what I stand for is against everything that's going on in Saudi Arabia at the micro level. Why don't I realize that at the macro level, using religion to dictate political, legal, judicial systems in my country is really bad? And say, I am never going to mention the Bible when I think about what we should be doing in terms of gay marriage, what we should be doing in terms of abortion, in terms of sex education, in terms of education in general, when it comes to science education. For some reason, they don't seem to get it. It's whenever we see these things happen overseas, it should really make us think about the Christian theocratic movement here in the United States. Perfect example of the Christian theocratic movement in the United States to compare and contrast with the latest atheism as terrorism laws in Saudi Arabia would be Brian Fisher from the American Family Association, who's been a guest on this program. We know that Brian Fisher is not a guy that subscribes to anything that is not based in the Bible when it comes to the law. And Brian Fisher has now said that with regard to incarceration, with regard to the law, with regard to adult relationships between presumably consenting adults, he would be absolutely fine with a 15-year incarceration for those who are guilty of adultery. Watch what he had to say.
I will be honest with you. I'm absolutely fine with a 15-year incarceration for the crime of adultery. It is a crime. It destroys people's lives. It destroys families. It breaks up civilizations. You want to lock them up for 15 years? I have zero problem with that whatsoever.
Okay. Under this logic, under the logic that the punishment should be severe because it destroys people's lives, homophobia destroys people's lives. Anti-gay bullying destroys people's lives. Should people go to prison for those things? Should you go to prison for being homophobic? Does Brian Fisher know how many people's lives, gay, straight, and otherwise, have been ruined by religion? Should religion be something you go to jail for? Obviously not. But I actually then said, hold on a second, wait, what does Brian Fisher's religion actually say about adultery? Brian Fisher's faith calls for death by stoning for adultery. And I believe that may even be for both parties involved. In fact, death by stoning is quite common in the Bible that Brian Fisher ascribes his beliefs to. Why isn't Brian Fisher fully advocating what the Bible says, which is stoning for adultery? For everyone that is criticizing Saudi Arabia, rightly so, for their religious-based laws, this is the exact same thing. Adultery is something that Brian Fisher's view is informed by through his religion. It is directly informed through his religion, and the idea that we have this horrible incarceration problem here in this country, and we're going to make it even worse by filling our prisons for 15 years at a time for people who committed adultery. Brian Fisher's suggestion is no different than the theocracy we see in the Middle East with Islam. He is suggesting the exact same thing with Christianity in the United States. Let's take a break. We have a great interview today with sociologist Wendy Manning. I'm sure you've heard about this Mark Regnerus study that the right wing is just frothing over to talk about how bad it is for children to be raised in same-sex households. Logical, clear-thinking individuals know it doesn't sound that like it's actually accurate. It's not. And sociologist Wendy Manning is going to be here to tell us all about it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
You are listening to and watching listener-supported, viewer-supported independent media. Our program is also made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com is your best source for unbiased news because spending $1 trillion on wars is freedom and liberty, but we don't have the money for evil liberal Big Bird. We heard that from Mitt Romney. If that sounds unbiased to you, you will love liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is William Mitchell. William, thanks for being a David Pakman Show member. I hope you'll consider joining William with a David Pakman Show membership. Go to davidpakman.com/membership. Monthly and yearly options exist. You get access to the bonus show, a full commercial-free archive of the video and audio versions of our program, and the full David Pakman Show archive with dates all the way back to 2005, August of 2005, the first iteration of the David Pakman Show. You can also support our program by doing your Amazon shopping through the link on our website. This is really easy. You go to our website, davidpakman.com. On the right side, you'll see a link to Amazon. Click it, bookmark it, and use that bookmark whenever you shop. It won't look any different. You don't have to fill out any forms. We'll get credit for your purchases and get a little kickback from Amazon. I always like to look over what our audience is buying from Amazon. We get no personal identifying information from anybody, just a list of items purchased. And I was interested to see that a lot of books, nonfiction books like The Dark Ages, history of psychology, history of archaeology, history of ancient Egypt. A lot of this stuff has been purchased lately. Some of it maybe for school, for some of our college student audience members. I've actually been reading quite a bit of this stuff lately. I came across the series, the Oxford Very Short Introduction series, which is very short introductions, little books about different topics. I picked up the one on prehistory, and it is very interesting. And it basically covers everything before roughly 3000 BC, where we have anything approximating visual or written history. And it's really a great read. And it's not only interesting to think about what life was like back then, but it's also interesting to read it in the context of so many of the debates now surrounding science and history connected to religion, and how religious beliefs of history compare and contrast with those of fossil records and other things that can be dug up. So that's a very cool, I recommend that, Oxford's Very Short History to Prehistory. Shredders, a lot of shredders being purchased by our audience. I used to shred all documents when I was done with them, anything from our payroll check stubs that are sent every time we run payroll to old checks after they've been deposited, all that stuff. And lately I haven't been. I've now been taking the tact of just ripping stuff up small and throwing it in the trash can, but maybe I should actually go back to a shredder. I've always felt like the shredding is a little paranoid, but at the same time, somebody could grab some of those pieces of checks that I throw in the trash when they come in to clean our office and, I don't know, do something with them, I guess. Send me your thoughts. Is shredding all your documents paranoid or just perfectly logical? I don't know. We've covered Glenn Beck's morning meetings a little bit. So Glenn Beck on his new program sometimes will film these morning meetings that they have in the morning, as the name would suggest, with his staff. To me, it seems pretty forced, okay? So when I see it, it doesn't seem like, hey, we just threw a camera up in the corner of the room and it's just showing what's going on and nobody's playing to the camera in any way. Putting aside how staged they are or aren't, I'm going to play a clip for you of a Glenn Beck producer talking about a government, some kind of government picture book for kids. And then Glenn Beck all of a sudden says, you know, I've got a picture book, I've got a government book for kids also. And he pulls out a Nazi book and basically equates it to the USDA book, which is encouraging children to try out different foods. Watch this.
Talk about the USDA story.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up.
Hi, Just. I mean, you're a grandpa, and you could tell Lorelai any story you wanted. Mm-hmm. So why not go for the government bedtime story?
I didn't know the government had a bedtime story.
They have a bedtime story about little cats, and the cats...
Where do you get the bedtime story?
It's available in English and Spanish. It's an educational storybook about a family of cats that uses government charts to determine their food intake. I think
This is great.
Do a good story.
You're gonna love this. Because it's always so great when governments publish kids' books.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Look at this. This is a government storybook, kiddos. Look, I want to show you.
It also has a cat, I think.
This is a great. Well, this is a story about a fox. The fox and the Jew. And how you shouldn't trust. See, here's the Jew. You can tell he's a Jew, right?
First of all, if we believe, which I have a hard time believing, if we are to believe that these are really impromptu little segments that Glenn Beck sets up, why does Glenn Beck just have Nazi books for children hanging around just a few feet from where the morning meeting is taking place? So if you believe this wasn't staged, Glenn Beck seems to keep Nazi books on hand. That's odd. But there's another broader thing here. We talk a lot on this program about propagandists mentioning Hitler, making allusions to Hitler, saying something now is like Hitler or the Nazis. And I've been thinking about why this is. And I know that at its fundamental level, at its surface level, we could say, well, they just know it's going to get a reaction, right? Comparing things to Hitler means that those things must be really, really evil things. And I think that that is part of it. But there's another part of it, which I think is less addressed, which is these guys on the right want to create the idea that they're some type of freedom fighters fighting against something similar to, something as evil as Nazis and Hitler and the Nazi agenda. And I think that is actually what is underlying so many of these equations to Hitler and the Nazis, which is they want to be seen as fighting against something that evil. They're that good because they're fighting against something that is that evil. Also evil, according to some, is the television program Glee. This is really funny. This is from Salt Lake City over the weekend. Ryan Anderson from the Heritage Foundation, the right-wing group, claims that same-sex marriage is, quote, an elite luxury good bought for on the backs of the poor. He was talking about U.S. versus Windsor, in which Edith Windsor argued successfully that she was unfairly forced to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes after her wife's death because the Defense of Marriage Act prevented the government from recognizing their marriage in the first place. And Anderson absurdly claimed that the media suppressed the real facts of the case. As usual, you didn't get the real facts, and insisted that the solution was just to repeal the estate tax, something that the right has been wanting to do for a really long time. But the discussion from Brian Anderson wasn't just about public policy. Later, he was asked by the audience about, you're going to love this, subliminal messaging in pop culture. And he talked about how the program Glee is corrupting the nation's youth. Check this out.
Another question, how is, and I'm reading this cold, so bear with me, how is subliminal messaging used to desensitize people, especially youth, getting them and to accept same-sex marriage?
All right, so
in other words, what is Hollywood doing to us?
Yeah, so if I understand the question right, I think what lies behind it is the reality that the television show Glee has done just as much to corrupt a young generation about marriage than anything the Supreme Court has done. And that we have to be sensitive to what sort of popular entertainment we're consuming at home and how that's shaping our children.
How weak are your right-wing values if the tiniest fraction of America that actually watches this program is able to be corrupted, right? Your views must be so weak that just watching a couple of episodes of Glee completely turns people off from the, I guess, being anti-gay is what he's talking about. And he seems to be visibly upset that a show that's been on for 5 years, simply spreading a message of equality, unity, is corrupting to our youth, and it seems to be overshadowing his, 1,700-year-old religion that's been corrupting youth in different ways for a really long time. There is nothing you can really do short of a criminal level of isolation and child imprisonment that will stop your children from growing up in the real world, right? That's really what this is about. Increasingly, as equality and just fundamental messages of human rights start to spread, it becomes more and more difficult for these right-wingers to insulate their children through their entire childhood from messages of equality. 75% of those who are homeschooled in the United States are evangelical Christians. It really tells us a lot about the remaining areas, aside from a lot of the public schools that now unfortunately are teaching creationism in the classroom. That is one of the few ways to really isolate your children from the real world and the direction that the real world is going. And Brian Anderson and the Heritage Foundation picking on Glee, saying Glee is what's corrupting our youth. No, our youth are just growing up in a world where it's not a big deal if someone has two dads or if someone is gay or lesbian or bisexual, transgender themselves. This is hugely scary to people at the Heritage Foundation. Let's take a break. Join us on Facebook, facebook.com/David Pakman Show. Wendy Manning is next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We're speaking today with Wendy Manning. She's a family demographer in the sociology department at Bowling Green State University. She also co-directs the National Center for Family and Marriage Research. It's great to have you on. You know, we've been talking about the University of Texas at Austin sociologist Mark Regnerus, who has gained significant notoriety after publishing a journal article which claims that children of same-sex parents don't do as well, don't have that ideal outcomes in life, which was controversial because it ran contrary to many studies that preceded it. So let's start at the very beginning if we can. What was the basis and what were the parameters of this study that was done?
I think I wasn't part of the original study, so I can't speak to the motivations for why they did it, but I think their goal was to try to capture a wide range of family experiences and try to assess different indicators of well-being. And they wanted to capture a large sample was a goal of theirs. A lot of the prior work had been based on smaller samples, and so they wanted to contribute to the field by collecting a large sample that would be nationally representative.
So who did the study talk to? What were the questions that were asked, or how was data gathered about the families, about what determines whether a child is in a so-called same-sex household, and how is that all done?
So basically they talked to adults who were 18 to 39 years old and asked them about their family experiences. And that's a fairly traditional way to study family life and childhood family experiences. But rather than asking a question such as, have you ever lived with a same-sex parent? Is your parent lesbian or gay? They really asked if your parent had ever had a sexual or romantic relationship with someone of the same sex. And that, to my knowledge, is the first time that approach has been used to determine the family circumstances of children. And as you can imagine, children aren't privy to all of their parents' sexual or romantic experiences. And so this is a sort of unusual way to capture children's living circumstances. And at the same time, he never really established in the first study whether the respondent ever lived in this kind of family. He just said you were from a gay or lesbian parent family if your parent had had sex or a romantic relationship with someone of the same sex.
So let's talk a little bit about the numbers. We hear so much about this sample size of 3,000, and many of the advocates who say this study is absolutely accurate in saying that that children raised by same-sex parents don't do as well. But when you actually look at it, is it not true that all but 2 of those children came from households that were led by opposite-sex couples, if we are actually to look to break down those so-called 3,000 examples?
Well, I think heard a lot of different numbers thrown around, and the 2 is really a different number. I think the number that's, it seemed like maybe about 85 members of this sample had lived with a lesbian, had lived with their mother and her same-sex partner, so you might call that a lesbian mother family. It seems as if that is true. In his initial report that received a lot of publicity, he did not distinguish that, but then he was asked, there was a fair amount of critique of his study, and then he reanalyzed the data and came up with that. The 2 represent 2 children who were raised from birth until age 18 in a lesbian mother family. And so, and why that is important is that his contrast group are children who were raised in stable, married, different sex families. And so if you want to make similar comparisons, you can say, well, how do those kids fare compared to the 2 children who were raised in stable lesbian mother families? So that's where the 2 comes from.
So it would seem to me, and this is your area of expertise, not mine, so I ask this to you as an expert in this field.
Yeah.
If you were going to compare, if you want to really compare apples to apples, it would seem that you would need to compare the results of children raised until age 18, and from birth to age 18, in an opposite sex household with parents that are either have been together or separate the entire time, and the same circumstances from those in same-sex families, because otherwise I don't think you can really distinguish the effect of being in a same-sex household versus being in a household with divorced parents, which we know has an impact on development.
Right. I think your assessment is on target, and traditionally that's how we would do it. We would either look at children who were all from stable parent families, or we would include a variable in the analysis that indicated whether or not children had experienced the dissolution of their parents' relationship, or had been, we would have other indicators of family instability. And he seemed to really want to compare and make this firm contrast to the 2 biological stable parent families, but he didn't hold the same-sex families to the same standard, so it's hard to assess the findings. I mean, you also have to realize that a lot of children in same-sex parent families are the children of dissolved heterosexual relationships. So some children are adopted from birth. Some are adopted as preschoolers or even as adolescents into same-sex parent families. And then you have the children whose parents had maybe been together, biological parents are no longer together, but now they're being raised by a same-sex parent family. So there's a lot of pathways into same-sex parent families.
Right, that's the other issue. To say that you were raised in a same-sex household doesn't address whether one of those parents is the biological parent that was previously in an opposite sex relationship parenting that child, if the child was adopted into a family where neither of the parents is a biological parent. I think most of our audience understands the flaws with this. What I would be interested in hearing from you is that every week or every other week I get emails from those who are basically praying at the altar of Mark Regnerus when it comes to this study. And they tell me that the consensus from the sociological community is that this is a valid study that confirms it is worse for children to be raised in same-sex households. Where is that idea coming from? Is there any validity to that consensus in the sociological community?
There is, to my knowledge, no consensus. The American Sociological Association has prepared a brief, and I worked on that brief, and any researchers who study family, the sociology of family, and this is squarely where this work falls, do not agree with his assessment. We all have, there's always shortcomings with any research project, and as authors, we need to take responsibility for that and recognize the limitations. And in his own paper, he says that this paper cannot be used for the purposes that it has been used. He recognizes the flaws, but seems to be carrying forward anyway. So the consensus is not, and I would say using his own words from the study, he does not believe this study should be used to make policy about children in same-sex parent families.
So is it fair to say that the research, the importance of the research and the significance of the research is actually being taken by some even beyond where Mark Regnerus himself says the study should be used?
Yes, I agree. I mean, Mark Regnerus has made public statements. He's appeared in court cases. He was an expert witness in the Michigan case. So he seems to believe that his findings are can be used for the purposes that the research community disagrees with, and in his own paper he says they shouldn't be used for. So I think he's taking his findings beyond the scope of the work and the data that's possible.
We've been speaking with Wendy Manning from the Sociology Department at Bowling Green State University, also co-director of the National Center for Family and Marriage Research. Really a pleasure having you on. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I think you're really going to like this. The 700 Club, which we usually play clips of specifically about Pat Robertson, with Pat Robertson in them, they also have this thing called the 700 Club News, okay? And they have like a deep voice announcer type guy who brings you hard-hitting reports from around the world. Their latest report is about how Sweden is becoming just like North Korea. How is that happening, you might ask? What does Sweden have in common with the brutally oppressive dictatorship in North Korea? Well, let's see what the 700 Club News had to say.
Welcome to Utopia, also known as Sweden. Sweden has been a laboratory of social experiments. Swedish leaders believe they're building the perfect society. And Sweden has been compared to a couple of nations which also tried to build perfect societies, North Korea and the Soviet Union. If you don't like how Utopia is being built here, you won't be shot like in North Korea, but your life could become very unpleasant very quickly. We talked to several journalists who described a Stalinist-style atmosphere in Sweden, in which citizens are now afraid of saying anything that might get them labeled in the media as racist. Sweden is not going to become a third world nation tomorrow, but according to one report, one day it will.
We had a perfectly good country, a rich country, a nice country, and in a few years' time, that country will be gone.
Dale Hurd, CBN News, reporting from Sweden and Denmark.
Well, that's a shocker. You hear here from Dale programs and views that you won't hear anyplace else. He does a terrific job, but that's frightening because Sweden was the haven for people fleeing the Nazis during World War II, and it was a place of freedom and liberty and prosperity. To think they could be killed by political correctness, it shows what could happen here.
Yeah, there's a media in Sweden that's critical of racism. And that is very much going to make Sweden a third world nation, just like North Korea. Pat Robertson is completely right that you won't hear on other networks that Sweden is like North Korea and that it will soon become a third world nation because of political correctness, because it's a ridiculous story. And Pat Robertson is just eating it up. And I hope, I don't know how much our audience knows about Sweden. We've talked about Sweden off and on. Sweden is one of the most advanced countries in terms of technology, in terms of environmental impact, in terms of social services, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of happiness among citizens. Sweden ranks in the top 3 countries in the World Democracy Index. For comparison, the United States isn't even in the top 10. However, Liberia, a country whose convicted gold mine warlord was a business partner of Pat Robertson's, ranks very, very low on that World Democracy Index, much like North Korea, actually. In Pat Robertson's world, what Pat Robertson is saying is that racists being called racists in Sweden will topple them all the way down to the level of North Korea. It's an interesting point of view. I don't know that it's going to happen. I will stand by, and if it does happen, ladies and gentlemen, we will tell you. I got a really cool letter from Justin. Justin's a 10th grade student. I'll just read you what he had to say. This is about taking on his teacher when it comes to climate change. Listen to this. Justin said, "Hey, David, I'm in 10th grade. I've been listening to your show for about 2 years, and I wanted to share a story from my Western World History Honors class. My teacher started to discuss current events. Yesterday, one of the current events written on the board was Putin ready to do who knows what in Ukraine, and the UN calls an emergency meeting on global warming? ? When she started discussing the story, after spending 20 minutes talking about how much of a failure Obamacare is, she told my class it's no wonder that the useless UN is meeting on this with all of the pro-global warming money being shoveled at them, and that they should be focusing on something real like the situation in Russia. I raised my hand, Justin did, and told her all the climate change statistics I could remember offhand. We didn't have any electronics. I couldn't look anything up. Like, for example, carbon passing the 400 parts per million for the first time in human history, that climate change was getting to a point of no return and that we need to do something now. She then said something along the lines of, you can show articles that say things like that, and I can show articles that say the opposite. So Justin said to her, well, 97% of peer-reviewed scientific papers agree that global warming is man-made, so I can show you a lot more articles than you can. She ignored that, saying, no, Justin, it is 50-50. We really don't know what's going on with climate change. I then said, no, it's not 50-50. It's 97-3. And then the bell rang. Listen, Justin, this is a tough position to be in because the teacher is in a position of power, and you certainly want to not go totally crazy because you don't want to get in trouble. At the same time, though, you are completely right. Teachers aren't always right. Adults aren't always right. You have the facts in this case, and she doesn't. And it's abundantly clear if she spends 20 minutes in a class about Western world history, an honors class, trashing Obamacare, I would assume on completely trumped up false grounds, that this may not be a teacher that you want to rely on too much. Do what you can to get the grades you need. It's important to do well in honors classes especially. But absolutely great job. Excellent, excellent job, Justin. Let's play some of your voicemails. 219-2-DAVID-P is our voicemail number. Listen to this.
Hi, David and Louis. This is Ron from Hawaii. I was watching your segment on March 31st with Geraldo Rivera.
Mm-hmm.
You made note of his comments about so-called liberal media pointing out Republican wrongdoing and ignoring Democratic wrongdoing.
Right.
What I found by far more interesting was his statement that on the Democratic side, the politicians who are robbing are usually ethnic politicians, as in this case. So should I always vote for white politicians because they don't steal?
Well, the funny thing about that, you're completely right about what you're saying. The even funnier thing is most of the politicians in the Republican Party who are misbehaving are white. So couldn't we make the exact same argument? Hey, listen, if you take a look at that Republican Party, everybody who's breaking the law is white. Of course, most Republicans are white, so that would make sense. Excellent, excellent point. Let's listen to one more voicemail.
Hi, David. I'm Cindy again. Thank you for being one of the few media venues that tells us exactly what's going on. The Supreme Court has become exactly what Thomas Jefferson feared, a bunch of black-robed tyrants, anathema to our already flagging democracy. I don't know how they sleep at night. God help us.
Yeah, okay, on Cindy checking in. The decision from the Supreme Court raising the total that can be donated in an election cycle, in every 2-year election cycle, from $123,000, which almost nobody does to begin with, to no limit at all, was a disaster. No question about it. And we're going to keep covering what's going on with the Supreme Court. We've got the bonus show today. davidpakman.com/membership is the way to sign up. We appreciate your support. Big corporations have no control over our program. We are viewer funded, and I encourage you to become a supporter today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.